History has taught us that the Auschwitz concentration camp was a true hell. But if you were a woman, you had a date with the devil himself. From beginning to end, women were victims of the most horrifying acts of the Nazi regime. Beatings, rapes, forced prostitution, and the cruelest and most inhuman experiments. Those who arrived at the camp pregnant were forced to abort in the worst ways you can imagine, and if that weren't enough, they then tested brutal sterilization methods on them.
Nos decían, van a hacer todo tipo de experimentos con ustedes. Y el objetivo de todo eso es que nunca tengan hijos.
Most of them didn't live to tell the tale. Meanwhile, those who managed to overcome hunger, pain, and agony claim that a part of their being also died in Auschwitz. In this new video from Military History, we will learn about the torment of the women who ended up in one of the most terrifying concentration camps of World War II. Get ready to learn about one of the cruelest episodes of humanity.
No sabíamos dónde estábamos ni lo que nos estaba pasando. Cuando llegamos nos sorprendió el hedor bestial, terrible que había. Y ni un árbol, ni un pájaro. Un silencio absoluto.
Adolf Hitler built Nazi ideology on a profound racial basis. According to his view, all groups or peoples possessed inherent and immutable traits that were passed down from generation to generation. No individual could surpass the innate qualities of their race. For the Führer, these inherited characteristics were not only related to external appearance and physical structure, but also influenced modes of thinking, creative abilities, intelligence, cultural appreciation, physical strength, and military skill. Under these ideas, Jews were assigned a wide range of negative stereotypes and were considered a major threat. To maintain the purity of the German genetic heritage, the best option they found was to imprison and annihilate their principal enemy.
Luego nos pusieron un número en el brazo. A partir de ese momento, éramos solo un número. Después, llegamos al pabellón de los experimentos.
While the Nazis promoted reproduction among their people, they planned the total extermination of Jews in Europe. No distinction was made by sex or age, even children fell victim to the brutal Holocaust. However, the Third Reich frequently subjected women to cruel persecution solely because of their gender. In fact, certain spaces were specifically designated for female prisoners. Not only Jews, but also Romani, Polish, and additionally, individuals with disabilities. In May 1939, the SS opened Ravensbrück, the largest Nazi concentration camp established for women. It was discovered that over 100,000 girls had been imprisoned there when Soviet troops liberated the site 6 years after it began operating.
They made us stand for 24 hours in the square before sending us to the showers. There, we had to undress fully and wait for the Germans.
In 1942, a special complex for women was also established in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And it is here that we will focus to understand the greatest atrocities suffered by the victims detained in this notorious internment site. Some of the punishments inflicted were common to all the camps erected during World War II, such as euthanasia programs. This was part of the Nazi policy known by the code name Final Solution, which included mass shootings and the creation of gas chambers. This initiative, known as T4, was used in Auschwitz to mass murder Romani women and women with disabilities. However, it was only one of the terrible ways in which people could lose their lives. The German authorities sent prisoners to perform forced labor, under conditions that often led to their deaths. They were also particularly vulnerable to beatings and rape. In many cases, they were forced to have sexual relations to obtain food or satisfy basic needs. This occasionally led to pregnancies by Nazi men, and if the so-called racial experts determined that the child would not be able to germanize, the mother was forced to abort in an environment where both her life and the baby's had a virtually guaranteed fatal outcome.
SS commanders of the concentration camps had a keen eye on the populations and wanted a clock-like scientific sweeping control of them. This included ordering any pregnancies to be reported and for the women to receive abortions. Tragically, such force upon reproductive rights produced drastic measures. The pregnant women of concentration camps had two options. They could face the abortion the Nazis forced upon them, or they could hope to acquire an abortion secretly through fellow inmates. These latter abortions were an effort and hope to save the life of the mother.
The idea of concealing abortions was part of the mutual assistance practiced by imprisoned women, who formed groups with the goal of helping each other survive by sharing information, food, and clothing. Often, they came from the same city or province, had similar levels and styles of education, or shared family connections. Even so, unless one of the individuals involved was a health professional who was also imprisoned, the risk of death from such procedures was no less. You might wonder, why didn't they wait for German medical attention in these cases? The answer is as cruel as the entire experience in the concentration camp. Auschwitz had the involvement of a large number of renowned medical professionals, though they carried out the lethal brutality of the Nazi regime. In fact, their involvement may have been directly related to some of the most atrocious crimes committed within the camps where prisoners were held. Women in these places were subjected to a vast array of completely inhumane experiments. Driven by the Nazi program, it didn't matter if the victims ended up dying or the suffering they endured along the way. Ruthless individuals conducted all sorts of acts, justifying them as tests to learn how to treat certain diseases or to gather data on human tolerance under various circumstances. Thus, some people were frozen to death by exposure to excessively cold temperatures. Others were inflicted with severe wounds that were then infected to observe how the body responded. After painful and exhausting examinations that lasted hours, many were often given a direct injection of phenol into the heart, which caused death to allow for an autopsy and further results to support the research. The possibilities for experimenting at the expense of others' suffering knew no bounds, extending as far as the imagination of the perverse SS and Wehrmacht doctors.
One of the most vicious experiments was the transplantation of limbs. The process consisted of amputating legs or arms, which were transplanted to other test subjects. Anesthesia was practically never used, so the unfortunate women experienced absolutely inhuman suffering. At the end of the experiments, they were given lethal injections and their bodies were burned.
Among those responsible for the horrifying experiments, there is probably no name more infamous than Dr. Josef Mengele. He was interested in genetic issues and sought to study specific groups, such as dwarfs and particularly twins. In the initial phase of his experiments, he subjected pairs of twins and people with physical disabilities to special medical examinations that could be performed on living organisms. These procedures were generally very painful and became a harrowing experience for the hungry and terrified children. The victims were photographed. Plaster molds were made of their teeth and jaws, and their fingerprints and footprints were taken. As soon as he finished with these procedures on a pair of siblings or dwarfs, Mengele ordered their execution so he could proceed to the next stage of his experiments: the comparative analysis of internal organs during autopsy. Anatomical samples of pseudoscientific interest were preserved and sent to the Berlin Dahlem Institute for more detailed examination. However, these cruel experiments never yielded results of real scientific value. A particular case associated with the work of this Nazi figure was that of Ruth Elias. She was a young woman who was pregnant when she was transferred from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz.
Nazi medical experiments on pregnant camp inmates centered on studying the effects of starvation and malnutrition on pregnancy. In predominance, such experiments cost the lives of both the fetus and the mother. While the percentage of women who gave birth at Auschwitz was small, the majority would not survive, mostly ending in stillbirth or miscarriage. Without a doubt, the most traumatizing possible outcome was if the baby survived childbirth.
Ruth Elias survived the harsh conditions she faced, but something worse was about to happen. After she gave birth, the SS doctor ordered that her breasts be bound with a rope as part of an experiment to see how long her newborn daughter could survive without food. Although Ruth secretly fed the baby by soaking pieces of bread in water, the infant weakened and her stomach became distended from hunger. After seeing her suffer for several days, a Czech female doctor who was also imprisoned with Ruth convinced her to inject her daughter with a lethal dose of morphine, as she would not survive, thus ending her agony. Research on the effects of hunger on the human body continued under Dr. Johann Paul Kremer. He focused particularly on the liver and how it atrophied. After pushing his victims to the brink of death by starvation, he ordered them to be injected with phenol. At this point, it is necessary to review some key points. Hitler aimed for the Aryan race, which he associated with Germans, to endure while exterminating the Jews. Therefore, pregnancies among women of his racial enemy were a significant problem addressed with abortion. However, Auschwitz became a place where experiments were conducted to end this issue definitively through sterilization. The person in charge of this work was Dr. Klauberg.
Un buen día hubo una llamada especial. Klauberg en persona eligió a varias de nosotras. Formábamos filas de A5 y seleccionó a quien quiso. No daba miedo. Era pequeño, gordo, con sombrero tirolés, pantalón bávaro, medias blancas, grandes botas de montaña. No se correspondía con la imagen de las SS que una pueda tener.
But appearances can be deceiving. Karl Klauberg was a German who served as an infantry soldier during World War I. After that conflict, he studied medicine and eventually reached the rank of chief physician at the University Gynecological Clinic. In 1933, he joined the Nazi Party while being appointed associate professor of gynecology at the University of Königsberg. During his career, he conducted research on female fertility hormones and their applications. This allowed him to meet important SS members, as he was responsible for treating the wife of a high-ranking official. In 1942, he contacted the leader of the organization, Heinrich Himmler, and requested the opportunity to conduct mass sterilizations for his experiments. After receiving approval, he began his experiments in December of that year at the Block 10 laboratory in Auschwitz. His goal was to find an easy and inexpensive method for sterilizing women. In 2 large rooms on the 2nd floor of the building, several hundred Jewish women from various countries lived. Klauberg developed a non-surgical method involving the introduction of a specially prepared chemical irritant into the female reproductive organs, which caused severe inflammation. The formaldehyde preparation intended for the uteruses of his test subjects was applied without anesthesia, causing immense suffering, permanent damage, and severe infections. After several weeks, the fallopian tubes would close and block forever.
La función del bloque 10 era llevar a cabo un segundo genocidio. En otras palabras, matar a personas que aún no habían nacido para que ya no hubiera razas indeseables.
Klauberg's experiments killed some of the women he used as test subjects, while others were intentionally executed to perform autopsies and compare results. The killings were cold and conducted under the guise of supposed science, though they were as violent and cruel as those on the battlefield. Beyond those who died, it is estimated that around 700 women were sterilized with this brutal and painful method. Himmler wanted to know how long it would take to perform this procedure on 1,000 Jewish women, and the doctor's response was satisfactory regarding the request. In June 1943, during the final phase of the experiment, he wrote a letter to the SS leader in which he stated, "The non-surgical method for sterilizing women that I have invented is now nearly perfected. If the research I am conducting continues to produce the results it has so far, then an experienced doctor with a properly equipped clinic and the assistance of 10 auxiliary personnel will be able to carry out the sterilization of hundreds or even 1,000 women within a single day." The Nazi authorities were more than satisfied with the conclusions of the experiment, but the feelings were completely opposite for the victims who endured it.
Nos llamaban por nuestro número y luego Klauberg u otro tipo nos inyectaba algo en la vagina. Y después nos decía, ya no habrá más niños.
As if that weren't enough, Karl Klauberg was not the only doctor whose perverse actions condemned thousands of women in Block 10 to suffering. He was not alone, and like him, Dr. Horst Schumann sought a convenient method of mass sterilization that would enable the Third Reich to carry out the biological destruction of the conquered nations. This figure had his own method for depriving people of their reproductive capacity, and as in other cases, it was accompanied by torture and pain for Jews and other prisoners. A special team was set up for Schumann in one of the Auschwitz barracks, and from time to time, several dozen victims were brought in for him to experiment on. The sterilization experiments involved exposing the women's ovaries to X-rays. The doctor applied various intensities at different intervals in search of the optimal dose of radiation. However, the exposure caused severe burns on the subject's abdomens, groins, and buttocks, and suppurating sores that were resistant to healing. A survivor of those dark days in the concentration camp recalls the horror she could see around her during the gruesome tests.
Con las primeras que recibieron rayos X fue muy rápido. Yo fui la segunda y pasó muy deprisa. Luego les tocó a otras y cada vez las exponían más y más. Yo apenas noté nada. Me dejó una manchita roja, pero nada malo. La primera no tenía ni eso, pero en la tercera la mancha ya era más pronunciada y en la cuarta aún más, y las últimas se retorcían de dolor, se sentían mal y tenían que vomitar.
Many of the women died from complications resulting from radiation exposure, and it was concluded that the results of the X-ray sterilization experiments were not satisfactory. In fact, in an article sent by Schumann to Heinrich Himmler in April 1944, he expressed a preference for surgical castration, as it was quicker and more reliable. This meant that Dr. Klauberg was the only one who had a relatively successful outcome in his research, although this did not make him any less perverse than the others. In fact, the day would eventually come when he had to answer for his cruel acts. At the end of 1944, as the Red Army approached the Auschwitz camp. The doctor moved to the Ravensbrück concentration camp to continue his experiments with Romani women. However, Soviet troops captured him there in 1945. After the war, Klauberg was tried in the Soviet Union and sentenced to 25 years in prison. But in 1955, he was released under a prisoner exchange agreement. That same year, he returned to West Germany, where he was reinstated at his former clinic with the aim of continuing his scientific work from before the conflict. The Nazi seemed to have escaped blame and responsibility, but his ego led to his downfall. He behaved oddly, openly boasting about his supposed achievements in developing a new sterilization technique at the Auschwitz concentration camp. This destroyed any chance of remaining unnoticed, and just a few months after his return to German soil, public protests from survivor groups led to Klauberg's arrest. Ultimately, the doctor died on August 9, 1957, before his trial. He spent his final days in the city of Kiel, Germany, where he suffered a heart attack at the age of 58. Nevertheless, he left behind a legacy of horror that continued to haunt his victims for a long time.
Nos decían, van a hacer todo tipo de experimentos con ustedes. Y el objetivo de todo eso es que nunca tengan hijos. Y desde luego se puede decir que lo consiguieron.
Forever marked by the brutal and cruel experiments conducted at Auschwitz, these women continued with their lives. Many were unable to speak about their suffering due to shame, and it took decades before they were able to share their stories. On that long path of suffering, the vast majority of them were never able to have children. That was the cost of surviving the darkest chapter known to humanity.
Luego nos pusieron un número en el brazo. A partir de ese momento, éramos solo un número. Después, llegamos al pabellón de los experimentos.
While Auschwitz has gained worldwide notoriety as the ultimate symbol of the Holocaust, Ravensbrück represents a lesser recognized yet equally atrocious facet of Nazi barbarism. Behind its barbed wire and tall watchtowers, this concentration camp, exclusively designed for women, witnessed countless acts of cruelty and suffering. However, there was also space for resistance there. The evil unleashed at Ravensbrück surpasses what is imaginable to the human mind, reaching levels of depravity and genocide that defy comprehension. In addition to torture, multiple mutilations, mass murders, and summary executions were carried out in this camp, along with forced labor, humiliations, experimentation with extermination methods, starvation, and public humiliations. Some prisoners were forced to abort, while others had to give birth under conditions of absolute insanity. These atrocities were compounded by well-known mass murders in gas chambers and medical experiments that included forced sterilization. This happened under the watchful and complicit compliance of other women, the fierce Nazi guards who oversaw the camp. Explore with us Ravensbrück, a harrowing tale of torture and suffering that also reminds us of the immensely powerful human capacity to survive, even in the most extreme conditions. Nacht und Nebel, night and fog in German, was a sinister term used by the Nazis to designate those prisoners destined to disappear into the darkness of night and the silence of fog in the camps. In addition to being deprived of all freedom, these prisoners were condemned to live in a voiceless world, disconnected from the outside, and in inhuman conditions that preceded the gas chambers. With the euphemism, night and fog, they named more than 132,000 women who passed through Ravensbrück during the Second World War. This female concentration camp received prisoners of various nationalities, including British and American. It is estimated that around 50,000 of them never managed to escape from the brutality and sadism perpetrated by the SS guards. Among the prisoners were those involved in the black market, as well as brave women who openly defied the Nazi regime, from Jewish couples to women dedicated as nuns. From the moment of their arrival, the women were subjected to sexual abuse and relentless dehumanization. Survivors' testimonies painfully narrate the humiliations suffered, ranging from forced stripping to brutal beatings.
Había gente que no se querían morir. Caminaban y se caían, y se levantaban, y caminaban y caían. No se querían morir.
Now the question is, why isn't Ravensbrück talked about as much? Beyond the testimonies that confirm the countless atrocities inside the camp, the data is confusing. All documents were burned in a bonfire or in the crematorium ovens and thrown into the depths of the lake next to the camp. The contrast between inside and outside was ominous. While they had thousands of women locked up, Heinrich Himmler, the second highest-ranking leader of the Third Reich, was obsessed with having concentration camps built in beautiful landscapes. At the darkest moment of the war, 45,000 women lived confined in the barracks of the camp in conditions of extreme overcrowding, since the Nazi leader had ordered the construction of a small-sized camp, despite warnings from colleagues like Rudolf Höss, who reminded him that if war broke out, they would quickly run out of space. A curious fact is that only 10% of the prisoners were Jewish. Instead, the majority of its initial 2,000 inhabitants were Germans who had opposed Hitler. Among these early residents, a populous group of 500 Jehovah's Witnesses stood out, who considered Hitler the Antichrist and had already been through the Moringen camp before it was converted into a youth prison. Their faith in God rather than in the Führer led them to Ravensbrück. The hidden location of this women's camp was another reason why, for many decades after the war, little was spoken about what happened there. Himmler ensured that access to the campgrounds was deliberately far from the gaze of travelers. The apparent tranquility of Ravensbrück, with peacocks walking around and monkeys hanging from trees, and even the presence of a parrot that repeated words, was observed by some visitors who arrived at the camp without knowing its true nature. This almost idyllic scene, far from the common perception of a concentration camp, concealed the brutal living conditions of the prisoners. Added to this was what was already very common in other extermination sites: the use of phonographs at maximum volume playing classical music to drown out the horrifying cries of agony and pain. After the end of the war, and before the fall of the Berlin Wall, Ravensbrück remained in East Germany, the Soviet-controlled part, which made it off-limits for Western historians for years, who wanted to verify with their own eyes what some testimonies recounted. Despite the few proofs, fortunately for history and memory, some of these women survived hell and were able to testify to the reality.
Te sacaban de la cama a las 7 por la mañana. Esto era la muerte, porque cuando hay -12, -13, y no puedes más soportar porque no tienes nada, tienes este traje y el número aquí, y solo con esto teníamos que ir a trabajar.
Annetta Coletti's shocking account details the savage practices that all the Ravensbrück prisoners faced in captivity. It was commonplace for a handful of them to be whipped in front of crowds once a day as a form of intimidation. Some endured more than 25 lashes, a brutality that could be life-threatening. In addition to this physical violence, the women were subjected to horrific punishment conditions, such as being confined in flooded cells that caused hypothermia. To make matters worse, the medical experiments they suffered included drug testing without consent, deliberate infections, and intentionally caused bone fractures. One of these infamous procedures involved testing sulfonamides, a prototype for antibiotics. To do this, they first cut the women's bones, muscles, and nerves to infect them with bacteria through pieces of wood or glass, and then experimented with sulfonamide. Another grim experiment was the attempt to transplant bones from one woman to another, which in most cases left them mutilated. The putrefying wounds and excruciating pain led to the death of numerous prisoners at Ravensbrück, while those who survived were forever scarred with irreparable damage. Forced sterilization was another atrocity committed against women, often under deception and without their consent. Guards, including women who later faced trial for their crimes, were responsible for administering this suffering on a daily basis. Lesser-known humiliating treatment included the exhaustive gynecological examinations carried out on prisoners in deplorable and unsanitary conditions. The merciless guards used the same instrument, examining and taking samples from all prisoners, regardless of whether any of them had diseases such as tuberculosis or syphilis. Believe it or not, female prisoners were subjected to something far worse. Survivor Leah Zajac agrees with many of her companions in saying that there was a macabre torture that is impossible to forget: hunger.
Allí en el gueto ya empieza mi primer peldaño del infierno, porque empiezo con el terrible, incontable, y no se puede, el que no lo vivió no puede imaginarse lo que significa el hambre que me tocó vivir durante 4 largos años.
In addition to its function as a place of detention, Ravensbrück served as a training center for female guards, teaching them to impose a reign of terror over the inmates. Under the supervision of commanders like Max Kurgel and Fritz Siron, the camp had a staff of approximately 150 SS guards, responsible for the daily surveillance of the prisoners. Many of these soldiers were transferred to other camps, such as Auschwitz, where they continued to perpetrate acts of brutality. Upon arrival at Ravensbrück, prisoners were assigned a colored triangle indicating their category and origin, and their hair was shaved off, an act that was both physically and psychologically traumatic. In the Third Reich, although lesbian relationships were not explicitly prohibited like homosexual relationships between men, some women were sent to concentration camps for belonging to groups considered antisocial. This was due to social disapproval and reports from their communities, rather than directly for their sexual orientation. Lesbians were not perceived as a threat and were mainly seen as potential mothers of racially pure children. Regarding the internal organization of the camp, it was structured into 5 areas: the commander's office, the political department, the protective custody sector, administration, and a limited medical care zone. In just 7 years of the camp's existence, there were 3 directors at Ravensbrück, resulting in constant changes in leadership and the deepening of increasingly ruthless extermination policies. From December 1938 to April 1939, SS Colonel Günther Tamaschke was in charge of Ravensbrück. Starting from January 1, 1940, SS Captain Max Kugel officially took over as camp commander. The functioning of the camp was meticulously organized. The main area consisted of 18 barracks. 2 functioned as infirmaries, another 2 as warehouses, 1 as a punishment block, and 1 more as a prison until a separate facility was built in 1939. The remaining huts served as housing for the prisoners, where they slept on 3-tier bunk beds. Despite having washrooms and toilets, the sanitary conditions were extremely poor, deteriorating significantly due to the increasing number of inmates after 1943. Food rations were meager from the beginning, and decreased further in both quantity and quality from 1941 onwards. By January 1945, the barracks were terribly overcrowded, exacerbating the already deplorable hygienic conditions, which led to a typhus epidemic spreading rapidly throughout the camp. At the peak growth of the camp, the vast number of hostages overflowed the capacity of the rooms, as Judith Becker mentions in her testimony.
In Ravensbrück, they didn't put us into any of the barracks. They right away straight put us into the Totenbark, into a barrack for death, for killing. And the method they used was that into an area that that could hold 100 people, they put 1,500. And there was no room to stand. There was no furniture in the place. There was no room to stand, so some people were hanging in the air.
Due to this overcrowding, the SS authorities subjected the prisoners to periodic selections, where those deemed too weak or injured to work were isolated and murdered. Initially, chosen inmates were cowardly shot. However, starting in 1942 as part of Operation 14F-13, the SS transported them to the Bernburg Sanatorium. Roma and Jehovah's Witnesses were sent to their deaths at Bernburg in the spring of 1941. Subsequently, in 1942, a second wave of killings began in these euthanasia centers, continuing until 1944. During this phase, approximately 60 convoys departed from the extermination camp to the euthanasia center in Hartheim, Austria. SS personnel also carried out killings in the camp infirmary, using lethal injections or by sending prisoners to the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination center. In early 1945, the SS installed a gas chamber at Ravensbrück, where between 5,000 and 6,000 prisoners were murdered before the Soviet liberation in April 1945. Prisoners at the camp documented the horrors they endured through clandestine photographs. Many were selected to be forced into brothels for military personnel. The rest were condemned to forced labor, with approximately 3,600 executed at Uckermark Mansion. Despite everything, horror did not extinguish hope. At Ravensbrück, women forged strong bonds of solidarity that provided invaluable emotional and physical support. These connections gave them the strength to face despair, endure grueling forced labor, and withstand torment specifically directed at them as women. Sorority and collaboration among the prisoners became a powerful mechanism of survival, offering them a ray of hope amidst the Nazi night and fog. Within the camp, some seamstresses found refuge in their joint work. Despite the long hours, being part of the select group gave them an identity beyond the number tattooed on their arms. Their companionship restored a sense of humanity and hope amid the desolation of the concentration camp. Sewing skills became an invaluable resource for many of them. Through their mastery of the craft, they kept the hope of freedom alive. Although they could not afford mistakes, the intimate atmosphere and conversations reminded them of their humanity and provided a respite from the brutality surrounding them. Luck also played a crucial role in the prisoners' survival. Despite being strong and resilient, they needed a stroke of fortune to safeguard their lives in such a hostile environment. The light at the end of the tunnel was finally seen on April 27th. A column of 20,000 prisoners was abandoned by the SS in Malo. The horrors ended when the Red Army liberated the main camp on April 30th and the subcamps on May 3rd. A year later, in 1946, the Hamburg trials took place where guards accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity were sentenced to death, but it took decades for the full testimonies to be heard. It is important to remember that justice continues to pursue those who participated in atrocities during the Second World War. Elfriede Lena Rinkel, a German citizen, was deported in 2006 after admitting her involvement as a guard at Ravensbrück. Her expulsion underscores the commitment to justice in prosecuting Nazi perpetrators and holding them accountable under the law. Through the efforts of the Office of Special Investigations, former participants in Nazi persecution residing in the United States continue to be identified, investigated, and legally pursued. Aside from the bloodthirsty Rinkel, more than 100 individuals have been prosecuted for their complicity in Nazi crimes. Although the damage is irreparable and justice comes late, the survivors of Ravensbrück recounted their experiences with superhuman strength. While in the extermination camps, some of them cultivated poetry writing as a means of relief and healing. These poems were like secret messages, filled with longing and pain, written on scraps of paper under difficult conditions. Today, their texts reach us as cries for help from the past, hoping to be heard and remembered. Poetry in the concentration camps not only became a means of individual and collective expression, but also a tool to keep alive the memory of those who suffered and died in darkness. A constant call from the past for humanity, never to forget its capacity for both suffering and hope.
But our Sturmälteste, and this is why I maintain all the time that humanity did not die during the war.
Despite everything, even in the hell of Ravensbrück, Humanity did not die yet, and from all the scars and pain, the highest resilience always stands out. Thank you very much for staying until the end. We look forward to seeing you in the next installment. Share this video with anyone you think might be interested, and subscribe now to access more impactful and revealing stories about the Holocaust. Don't miss the opportunity to discover the truth behind one of the darkest chapters in history. Until next time.